Nathan Scott, a Marine veteran, stepped out onto the porch of his cabin in Wyoming just as the air shifted abruptly and the wind began to slam hard, as if it were warning of something. He rested his hands on the railing and took a deep breath. That metallic smell meant only one thing: heavy snow, a real storm. At his feet stood Echo, his gray and white German shepherd, still and alert, staring at the horizon just like him. Nathan had been living this way for years, cut off from the world since the death of his wife Kate, and his appearance said it all. Worn clothes, an unkempt beard, tired gray eyes, a man who had chosen to disappear. The satellite phone rang inside the cabin, which was already a bad sign. He answered and recognized the anxious voice of Grace Mitchell, his nearest neighbor, worried about a rental cabin deeper in the woods where a couple was supposed to have arrived, but there were no signs of anyone. She asked him to go check before the storm closed the road. Nathan didn't want to go out or get involved, but Grace never asked him for anything, so he agreed. He called Echo, they got into the truck and moved slowly along the forest road, which was already turning slick as snow began to blanket everything and the wind shoved the vehicle as if trying to force it off the trail. When they reached the Aspen cabin, there were no lights and no car. Nathan sighed in relief, thinking no one was there. He stepped out of the truck, and that's when Echo exploded. He barked like never before, lunged at the door, howling and clawing in desperation. This wasn't a normal alert, it was pure panic. Nathan felt an old cold knot in his stomach. He opened the door and Echo bolted straight toward the cabin, ignoring everything else. He planted himself in front of the main door and began pounding and scratching at it furiously. Nathan approached, called out, no answer. He put his hand on the knob and felt it was unlocked. He pushed carefully and went in. The interior was freezing and dark, and it smelled wrong, an expensive perfume that didn't belong there. He moved cautiously and saw her. She was curled up in a corner, almost invisible, sitting in a broken wheelchair, trembling uncontrollably, her face pale and her lips blue. Echo stopped barking and approached her, whining softly. The woman looked up at him, terrified, and begged him not to hurt her. Nathan spoke slowly, introduced himself, and asked if she was injured. She said her fiancé had abandoned her after an argument, shoved her, broke the chair, and took the car, leaving her there. Nathan looked at the bent wheel, then at the storm already roaring outside, and understood that the cabin wouldn't make it through the night. There was no firewood or generator, it wasn't a place to stay. He sighed in frustration, it wasn't his problem, but he was already there. He told her they were going to his place. She hesitated and mentioned the wheelchair. Nathan didn't argue. He knelt down and lifted her carefully but firmly. She was lighter than he expected. He carried her outside while Echo stayed tight against his leg. The trip back to his cabin was a battle against wind and snow. Nathan moved almost blind, shielding her with his body, until he finally opened the door and shut the noise of the world outside. The warmth of the fireplace wrapped around them instantly. He set the woman on the couch in front of the fire, stoked the flames, told Echo to lie down, and went to make hot coffee. He handed it to her and held her trembling hands so she could drink. He told her plainly that she couldn't leave, that they'd be trapped for several days. His tone wasn't kind or cruel, just direct. He gave her blankets and told her to cover up and change out of the wet clothes, then turned away to give her some privacy. He secured the doors and windows as the wind battered the cabin. The lights went out, and he lit oil lamps without a word. The silence grew heavy. Echo never stopped watching her, not aggressively, but as if judging every movement. Nathan barely spoke. He made it clear he didn't expect thanks, that he was doing this for Grace and for the dog, not for her. He took his rifle, sat in a rocking chair at a distance, and opened a book. Outside, the storm roared without pause, and inside, the woman wrapped in blankets understood that she wasn't only trapped by the snow, but by something heavier, the calm, distrustful gaze of a man who asked for nothing and a dog who seemed to see everything. The first full day trapped by the storm passed slowly and heavily, as if time itself had frozen along with the outside world. Beyond the walls there was nothing but white, wind and noise, an endless wall of snow battering the cabin without rest, and inside, the silence was different, thick and uncomfortable, filled with things left unsaid. Nathan moved through the cabin with a precise, austere routine, as though every gesture had been rehearsed for years. He rose before dawn, stoked the fire without a sound, and went out to shovel a narrow path to the woodshed, returning covered in snow, without complaint, without looking back. He made coffee and a bowl of hot oatmeal, set them on the small table beside the couch where she remained wrapped in blankets, and said nothing. She ate in silence, guilt souring her mouth more than the cold. She felt out of place, like an intruder in a space that did not belong to her. When she tried to speak, to ask how long he thought the storm might last, Nathan barely glanced at her over his shoulder and went back to what he was doing, leaving the question hanging in the air. Echo was always there. When Nathan went outside, the dog lay by the door, watchful and still, his eyes fixed on her. When Nathan was inside, Echo settled near the fireplace, head held high, ears tuned to every movement. He didn't growl, didn't move too close, he simply watched, and that constant vigilance began to unsettle her more than the man's silence. She was used to different dogs, ornamental animals, well-groomed, obedient out of habit, not out of true loyalty. Echo was not like that. Echo seemed to understand things. She tried to approach him that first afternoon, spoke softly, told him she was grateful, that she was glad he had found her, but the dog only tilted his head slightly and kept watching her, unmoving, offering no response. Later, during dinner, when Nathan heated a simple canned stew, she broke off a piece of bread and offered it to Echo, trying to create some kind of connection. The dog looked at the food, then at Nathan and stayed still. Nathan spoke from the shadows, his voice dry, telling her not to feed him like that he ate from his bowl. She withdrew her hand, embarrassed, and didn't insist. That night was worse. The wind slammed against the cabin as if it wanted to tear it from the ground, the walls creaked and the roof groaned under the weight of the snow. She couldn't sleep. Her body ached, not from the paralysis she pretended to have, but from the constant tension of controlling every movement, of not stretching, of not giving herself away while fear kept her awake. Nathan didn't sleep on the couch as she expected. He pulled out a cot and set it near the door, the rifle within reach. He said nothing, but it was clear he was on watch. The second day was just as silent. Nathan kept to his routine, checking the cabin, tending the fire, measuring the wood as if she weren't there, as if she were just another thing the storm had to endure. She began to observe the place more closely. There were no luxuries, no unnecessary decorations. The furniture was old but cared for. The shelves were filled with worn books, manuals, history, philosophy, practical things and deep things, with no intention of impressing anyone. Everything in that house spoke of someone who lived with little, but with purpose. Then she saw the photograph above the fireplace. A younger Nathan, smiling, with a woman beside him, radiant, alive. She understood then that the cabin wasn't just a shelter, it was a sanctuary, a place built to survive the world and grief. And she had entered it with a lie. The lie began to weigh on her in earnest, not as a strategy, not as something necessary, but as a stain. She, who could buy 10 cabins like that without a second thought, pretended to have nothing, pretended to be broken, pretended to need help. And Nathan, without asking for explanations, had pulled her out of the cold, given her warmth, food, and shelter, demanding nothing in return. That night, as the fire crackled and the oil lamps cast long shadows on the walls, guilt settled in her chest like a physical weight. She looked at her reflection in the dark window and barely recognized herself. She thought of Vincent, of how he would have reacted, his impatience, his contempt for a place like this, his constant need for control. Nathan was the opposite. Nathan simply did what needed to be done. No speeches, no promises. The understanding came slowly, but it was devastating. She was the only false thing in that cabin. The air tightened in her throat, tears began to fall before she could stop them. She cried in silence, her face turned toward the window, biting her fist to keep from making a sound. She wasn't crying for the cold, or the storm, or even for Vincent. She was crying because she saw herself as someone capable of lying just to receive a little genuine kindness. In the middle of that silent collapse, she heard the soft sound of claws on wood. She held her breath and turned her head. Echo had stood up. He walked slowly toward her, without tension, without threat. He stopped a few steps away, looked at her intently, and tilted his head, as if weighing something deeper than her words or her appearance. Nathan lifted his gaze from the table where he was cleaning his rifle, alert to the movement, but said nothing. The dog took another step, then another, calmly, and sat down in front of the couch. He didn't come all the way closer, didn't touch her. He simply stayed there, watching her as she struggled to contain her tears, understanding for the first time since she arrived that this cabin was not a place where lies could hide for very long. The third night was the longest, not because the storm worsened, but because there were no distractions left to hide the inevitable. The wind kept pounding the cabin, constant and exhausting, like a reminder that there was no escape, and inside the fire rose and fell with the rhythm of the wood Nathan fed it so carefully. He sat at the table, cleaning his rifle with slow, methodical movements, each piece laid out in order on an old cloth, the soft clink of metal filling the space. She remained on the couch, wrapped in blankets, her body tense and her mind overwhelmed. She could no longer keep up the charade without feeling herself break from the inside. Every time she moved, it was with fear, not of pain, but of the weight of the lie. She looked at Echo, who stayed close, alert, no longer so distant but not trusting either, as if the dog were waiting for something. Nathan lifted his gaze for a moment, looked at her without expression, and returned to his task. That silence, that lack of pressure, was what finally broke her. She swallowed, took a deep breath, and spoke in a low, fractured voice, saying she had to tell the truth, that she couldn't go on like this. Nathan didn't react right away. He finished cleaning the weapon, calmly reassembled it, and only then looked at her directly. She confessed that she wasn't paralyzed, that the wheelchair had been part of a lie, that she wasn't who she claimed to be, that she had money, more than she could spend in a lifetime. She spoke of Vincent, of how he had used her, of how she had used that story to test him, to see if someone could care for her without knowing who she really was. The words came out in a rush, tangled with shame and exhaustion. She said she felt disgusting for bringing that lie into his home, into a place that clearly meant something deep to him. When she finished, silence settled again, heavier than before. Nathan didn't raise his voice or ask questions. He stood, stoked the fire, and let the crackle of the wood fill the space. Echo moved a little closer to the couch and sat, calm. Nathan finally spoke, without harshness but without comfort, telling her he had already suspected it, that no one who had lived through what she claimed moved the way she did when she thought no one was watching. He told her he didn't care about the money or the story, that the only thing that mattered was that she was safe and that the storm was still just as dangerous for both of them. There were no reproaches, no explicit forgiveness, only facts. He said that at dawn the next day, if the wind eased even a little, he would go check the road and try to contact help. She nodded, eyes full of tears, understanding she deserved no more than that. That night she slept little, but for the first time without pretending, moving carefully, yes, but without fear of being found out. Echo settled near the couch, not touching her, but present. On the fourth day, the storm began to break. The wind died down, the sky revealed a lighter gray, and the world took shape again. Nathan went out to clear the way, checked the generator, and managed to make a call. Help would take time, but it would come. When a machine finally opened the pass and a vehicle appeared through the snow, she was ready to leave. She stood up from the couch, on her feet, without unnecessary explanations. Nathan looked at her, nodded once, and went to open the door. Before getting into the vehicle, she stopped, looked at him, and thanked him, not for saving her from the cold, but for showing her, without words, what it meant to live without lying to oneself. Nathan didn't respond. Echo sat beside him, watching as the vehicle disappeared among the trees. When the noise faded, Nathan closed the door, fed the fire again, and the cabin regained its silence. Outside, the storm had passed. Inside, everything remained the same, simple, honest, and steady, like the life he had chosen to live.